We can see your screen. I can't hear you though.
Sorry, I'm on mute.
Yeah, you're on mute.
There we go. Yes. Hopefully you can see my slide now.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Welcome.
Great. So it's a pleasure to be here. Please continue to add. It's hard for me to see the chat while we're presenting, but if anyone wants to come off mute and interrupt, please feel free. I left time for some dialogue and questions, so I'm not going to try to fill the entire 45, 50 minutes with talking. So I'm hoping this talk actually stimulates some thought about all of the different pieces around embracing context and the complexity that we have to do in order to realize the impact for AI in cancer care and cancer research and delivery. So I want to make acknowledgements to the team who have contributed various different pieces to the slides over time, as well as to my division, the Data Impact and Governance Division. We call ourselves DIG because we like to dig into the data. We like that acronym. Along with the innovation team, I also co-direct the Institute for Data Science and Oncology. And so and I really appreciate all the leadership within the IDSO who have continued to shape this, along with those in DIG and across the entire organization. You'll see how we've actually networked across the organization. But I'm going to give even a higher level view for all of you who may be either leveraging technology, using technology in terms of the AI space, as well as building it yourself. So when we actually think about where we've come in medicine, and the claims say that, you know, AI, the use of AI, medicine is way behind the ball. Other people say that we're ahead of the curve because we're accelerating faster than ever. I wanted to kind of take a step back and say, where are we actually currently in medicine, and where do we ultimately want to get to? So when we think about historical practices of medicine, and you have a clipboard, a stethoscope around your neck, and you're knocking on the door and you're going in to see the patient, the information that you're gathering in that moment is like trying to tell the weather, looking at a weather vane, or perhaps looking out your window. You can tell when it's raining. You can tell, perhaps, depending on how well your house is insulated, you may be able to tell if it's hot or cold. But sometimes you can look out the window and it looks cool. And in Houston, often when you walk outside, it's still steamy and hot, even though it looks like a cool day from just the visuals. And so that weather vane picture is one glimpse of the patient in that moment, but does not necessarily represent the entire picture. Now, we started to adopt a practice that we call evidence-based medicine, and that means taking clinical trial data, collating and bringing together clinical trial data, doing meta-analyses with these trial data to start to guide the practice of medicine in larger patterns and understanding of the data that we're actually collecting in clinical trials. And if you look at that kind of data, the Cochrane collaboration is one example of a collation of all the meta-analyses around clinical trials that have been run across medicine. And I liken that to the Farmer's Almanac. So I'm not saying it's not a negative statement, it's just around how can it be used. The Farmer's Almanac is excellent at predicting large weather patterns that happen consistently over time, similar to the fact that the Cochrane collaboration may be great at collating large population responses to different treatments, interventions that have come across clinical trials over time. But the kind of information we all want is this geospatial dynamic updating of weather, so we know if a hurricane or a tornado or something is coming at us, or if it's going to rain tomorrow, or how cold or hot it's going to be. These are the kinds of things that would help us make day-to-day
We can still see you and we can see the slides, but I can't hear you anymore, Dr. Chung.
We actually may be able to hear you. Are you speaking?
Yeah, I think she's not able to hear us.
I think that's
Oh,
right.
sorry, my
Yeah,
internet went out for a moment there. Yeah, sorry about that.
yes, we could.
Can you still
Yeah,
see my slides?
yes, we can, and we can hear you as well.
Okay. Okay, so my internet went out for some reason. I'm not sure what happened there.
No worries.
So what I was saying is that we have all the data. We have all kinds of data coming at us, and we're generating more data than ever, whether it be radiological data, genomic data, various clinical measurements, lab measurements, even the wearables, information off our phone can technically stream into the decisions we're making. We have not quite gotten to the point of creating this sort of GPS map and creating that sort of digital twin rendition of our overall health. But that is on the horizon, and that's the really exciting piece of personalizing treatment. Now, as we start to think through how are we going to tackle this mountain of data coming at us, I always get grounded by Albert Einstein's statement that if you're trying to solve a problem, spend 55 minutes really thinking about that problem, and the answers will come much faster and you can solve it much quicker. So this is not necessarily purely a technological challenge. It's really thinking through what are we actually trying to do now that we have this sort of information coming at us. And this is where the complexity and the context really starts to come to play. So I think this audience is probably familiar, but just in case people are joining, I wanted to give a landscape of that there are, when you say the word AI, it means a lot of things to a lot of different people. So I wanted to kind of go across very quickly across the scope of AI models that we're leveraging in oncology today. So it includes the traditional supervised learning type models, where you have human annotated data, you're training, validating, testing, and then deploying into the real world. There are the exciting foundation models and emerging growing foundation models, and we're still learning about their capabilities, but these are large scale pre-trained models that we can actually fine tune for particular indications. They look very impressive. There are definitely some limitations and guardrails that we need to think about as we start to deploy this into the medicine space. Multimodal models. Now, many of the supervised learned models are actually in a single modality, but now we can start to combine different imaging with genomics and clinical data, different data domains being combined together. And then there's this rise of hybrid and ensemble models, and especially now with agents that are able to take outputs of one model, feed that into the next model, and be able to continue to daisy chain some deliverables. These are all being explored. Not all of them are in full-time, prime-time use in the clinic, but they're all being explored, and they're at various different stages of maturity. And for all of these models, I would say that this statement is true, that creating a publication, doing a nice research study, even doing a nice pilot study may show some success, but moving from that space into full-on deployment, implementation, and impacting patient outcomes is a whole other step. And there is currently a chasm between those two. And my argument is that the context is that critical bridge to realize and bridge together these two different worlds. And there's a great publication that came out in a gastroenterology journal that actually showed the reason why. When you actually are building and going through this publication pilot phase, you're working on data on the left side where you've gone through a data curation collection exercise, you've pre-processed and cleaned that data, made it look really pretty for model training, and then you get out outputs that look really promising, so you go ahead and publish. And then when you actually say, let's say you're getting to the point where you're going to evaluate it in the real world, and I'm using air quotes when I say the real world, the challenge there is that many times groups will actually make the same level of effort of collecting data, pre-processing, getting cleaned data. So it's not real world data, it's cleaned real world data. And then they say, oh, it seems to appear and work fine. And then a new patient comes in, and that patient has 3 of the necessary data elements missing, or the quality of the data coming in is not matched to your cleaned, curated data set that you used for validation. And yet the output is coming out, and this clinical decision maker with the patient may not realize the difference, and the output may not be as reliable as we think it is based on our initial validation data. And it's really thinking through the context in which you're going to use the data, use the AI model, and making sure that you're evaluating that context that will allow you to really be able to scale and implement AI in a meaningful way. And so when we think about context, there's various aspects. There's the people, the operational workflows, and the integration across the digital environment. The purpose of the model, what is it going to do? Is it just for research discovery, or is this really going to touch a patient at the other end? What is the state of your data, and how well is it seamless? Is it seamlessly flowing through with reliable quality and timeliness, et cetera? Or is it that you need to put a lot of manual work to make that appear? And how realistic is that to have happen in your operational workflow? And finally, the regulatory pieces, which many of you are probably familiar, are rapidly evolving over time because we're sort of bringing out technology and making up the rules as we go all at the same time. And so these are all the different contextual pieces that if we start to think about as we're developing, you'll be in a much better state. The reason why I'm pointing this out is that for those of you who are excited about developing models and excited about data science, I would say that the many research individuals, as well as many startup companies, start with this red circled portion of this entire ring. They look for, where can I get enough data to train a model? And then they go and train a model, and then they say, I'm going to show it to someone who seems to have a problem that will be addressed by my model. And then they go almost backwards through this circle. And the problem there is that when you start with just the data that's available, remember what I just showed, that often the kind of data that's available is the cleaned, curated data. It's not the data in the context in which you're going to use the model. So if you shift your focus and start with, what is the problem you're actually trying to solve? Going back to Einstein's quote, what is that question you're trying to answer? And in some of the circumstances at our institution, as we talked through that problem that we're trying to solve, although right now, in many circumstances, it feels like AI can solve everything, there are certain situations, once you talk through the problem, you may realize AI was never going to be the solution because it was never the problem in the first place. In other circumstances, you may say, yes, there's a promise that AI could potentially be a solution, but perhaps the data that you need to have run continuously for this model to work may or may not be available. And that's when you should be asking that question. And then you need to think about, if we do have the data, we do train a good model to work, because that technical hurdle is usually not the problem. You need to think about, are the stakeholders that are going to use this model, are they ready to do this? And what operational changes would they need to make to allow this model to drive efficiency, rather than adding another widget into the process and perhaps adding additional alarm bells, adding alarm fatigue, potentially creating new automation bias that you have to overcome. So really thinking through, what is that operational readiness of the team, because that will shape how you're going to implement that model and what that model output may look like. And then finally, what kind of training will be required so that the team and the stakeholders who are using this model will understand the model outputs? And this is where I think many of the models early on, and this is a shifting, I would say that this is actually shifting in live time, and I'm glad this is shifting, is that the model outputs need to present some level of uncertainty, because when we think about human decisions, we always think about, do we trust this output? Is how much uncertainty is in this output? If I told you, going back to the weather example, that there's a 50% chance of rain, and my confidence is from 0 to 100%, it basically means I have no clue what the weather is going to be tomorrow, versus saying there's a 90% chance of rain and it's somewhere between 70 to 100%, in which case, if you don't want to get wet, you'll probably wear a raincoat or carry an umbrella. So the approach to how you're going to solve these problems, whether you're trying to start a startup or creating a tool that you want to use and eventually in an operational fashion, think through all of these pieces. And I would argue that you need to start with really defining out that problem, who is involved in that, and think through all of these different pieces. And finally, I'll talk towards the end of my talk around ML ops and just model lifecycle management, that a model that works on day one does not necessarily work even on day 7, depending on what's happened in the context of your environment. Now, as I said, if you start with your purpose, then you can actually think about the fit for purpose. And this is important because I think many of the hype titles and headlines will say AI hammer going around looking for nails. And it's a great example that people were trying to get LLMs to do math. And if you really take a step back and say, why are we trying to get LLMs to do math? Because it may take you half an hour of prompting to get a consistent answer, when you could use a calculator that's on your desktop. You could use other tools that could actually go much faster. So it's that trying to make sure that you don't lose sight of the fact that there are fit for purpose tools for certain tasks, and just really paying attention. And this is even true as sophisticated as the technology can get. I was really honored to be included in the authorship of the National Academy's report, where we actually wrote about the foundational gaps of digital twins, and we actually call out this fit for purpose importance, even in digital twins, as one of the conclusions of our report, that you don't need to make things more complicated than you need it to be, because life is complicated all by itself. So try to think about the simplest solution that will actually address the problem that you're trying to solve. And I would say that generative AI overall is still a solution in search of a problem in many circumstances. And part of it is the fact that there's been a lot of hype, there's been a lot of headlines making claims of what it can and cannot do. I would really recommend that when you read these papers, if you dig deeper, you will start to understand what are the statistics that are being reported in the headlines, and what is your interpretation of those statistics. And it may mean that you need subject matter expertise in the particular topic in which the LLM was used, but you can play with the numbers and make something look really good, and it may not really make sense when you really dig into the details of the paper. So it's just a caution. There's a lot of papers out there, so I'm not going to say you have to read one or the other, but I think this is just a good grounding for you to make sure that you look past the headlines, look past the general blog posts, and read some of these papers for yourself and say, does this actually make sense? And how have they gamed or not gamed the statistics in their favor to make the model look good or not good? And you can push the numbers either way. You can actually say, I'm going to show that this is not working as well as I want it to, or I'm going to show that this actually really works. And it really depends on the design of the study. It's like any other scientific experiment. Now, the realities of the current LLMs, a lot of the performance is getting better, but the underlying architecture, I'm sure many of you appreciate, is that LLMs are really intended to predict what that next statement is likely to be based on the structure of the context of the language around it. And so if you think about that, the latest paper, this is from November, one of the later papers from late November in 2025 from MIT, the researchers had found that there is a shortcoming, that it can actually start to replace specific topics just based on the context around which that language is given. And there's been more recent publications that have actually shown that if you use very professional medical language, you can actually lead it astray, because it starts to believe what you're stating, even if you're incorrect, because you sound like a medical professional. So it's really taking in that entire surrounding language. And so it depends on how you ask the question. This is the famous one where someone said, if you ask any LLM, should I eat rocks? It'll say no. But if you phrase it in a way that it sort of validates that you want to eat rocks, and you say, how many rocks should I eat each day? It'll actually start to say, well, I can rationalize that, rocks are minerals, and minerals are part of your nutritional value. So it'll make up a number of how many rocks you should eat each day. So this is literally the context coming into play in not a helpful way. And so really setting the context of what you're trying to answer even when you're interacting with these LLMs is actually really important. I just thought that was a funny example. There's many examples in the literature, again, suggesting that we need to put safeguards around these types of models when we're actually implementing them in clinical care, or even for coding and for financial reasons. Now, let's think through the key role of context of data throughout its life cycle. So when you think about data, as I said, in the training, the validation, and the implementation phase, and we think about garbage in, garbage out, the quality can be different from the training and validation because you've cleaned and curated to the implementation. There's also biases that can be implemented. So for instance, we always say structured data is going to help us. I think now we think that LLMs are going to help us pull out the structured or relevant data even without the structure. But if you think about the biases that can be embedded, even with structured data, if the person interpreting that structured data element is filling in that data element with some understanding in their head that's different from person B, you're going to get bias that's going to consistently arise. And if you don't understand what that bias is, then you'll take it at face value. And so capturing the metadata around who is it? Are you seeing patterns on if physician A versus physician B, or nurse A versus nurse B is answering something pretty consistently in a different way? You may need to account for it somehow. It may be that you'll go back and clarify with that person. That's the first mile strategy, trying to fix it at the point of generation. Or you may say, I see a consistent pattern. I'm going to recalibrate and normalize that data and harmonize that data, knowing that there are differences between different individuals, or perhaps different clinics, or perhaps different countries. And so that's something to be mindful of. And then finally, in terms of, oops, trying to get this out of the way. In terms of the source, if you find out where it's coming from, that'll actually reveal that metadata around where it's come from could actually help you alleviate some of these sources of bias or quality issues. Now, the other piece that I'll call out is that, when we say we want everything to be high quality, people say, well, we're going to be waiting forever for high quality data. But the other argument is that good quality is really based on the intended purpose of what you're going to do. So one person's garbage might be another person's good data, depending on what question you're trying to answer. And this is where that metadata and the contextual nature will really help reveal a lot of whether your data is fit for purpose or not. And some more of the details around the principles, et cetera, I've published in Cancer Research down here in 2021. So you're welcome to take that reference and read further on the topic. In the paper, we highlight that observations need to be considered in context, meaning all that metadata around the data, that there is a dynamic assessment of quality, and that the provenance of where that data has come from and the journey that it's taken will actually reveal the biases, build confidence and trust, and allow you to actually utilize the data appropriately, including sometimes even addressing governance issues. For instance, if you knew the lineage of that data and you knew that data was coming from a clinical trial that is still running, then you will know that that data is probably encumbered and you should not be using it. So knowing the provenance of the data has revealed a governance piece around your data. And so being able to connect those pieces is actually a really valuable resource for you to actually govern your data appropriately. So these are the kinds of concepts that we elaborate on in the paper. Now, how do you build this out across an entire organization and an ecosystem? We started to build out, I started with the people. I started with culture and started with cultural engagement, growing data literacy, starting to talk about our core value of stewardship at our organization, talking about data stewardship, and making sure that you're collecting high quality data, that you're flowing high quality data as much as you can. And building out our shared contextual understanding of our data by making sure that we capture metadata. And we've built out an entire metadata supply chain with our data. So we're not just taking data at face value, we want data with context around it. And the analogies that I take in terms of the driving piece is that, this cultural engagement and growing data literacy is like getting your driver's license. We don't give everyone cars just to drive around with no rules. I guess at one point in time we did, but once there's enough traffic, and that's literally where we've come now, that there's more and more traffic on the data roads, that we all need to have certain levels of knowledge and get our driver's license. This shared mutual understanding of our data is really like making sure that our fuel is appropriate for the vehicles that we're driving. And it doesn't mean that all of us need to be super data scientists. There are going to be those who are supporting. I saw some data engineers that put their introductions in the chat. There are going to be data engineers, data scientists, ML engineers who are going to service and make sure that everyone's vehicles are working properly, make sure that there's safety checks, but it doesn't remove the responsibility of each individual still being able to know the rules of the road and being able to participate in the overall system. Make sure all the systems continue to work safely, and that no one is crashing into anyone else. And so here's a map of the entire data ecosystem that we've actually built out at MD Anderson. I genericized this because this is actually in a textbook that you can see the reference down below, where we actually shown our entire data and metadata flow. And the fact that we're looking at data and metadata, we've got stakeholders that include the clinicians, researchers, operational individuals, educational people, as well as external stakeholders coming into our environment, being able to explore the metadata to find and curate the data sets that they're looking for without access to the data itself. Make sure that they go through the appropriate governance steps to access the appropriate data with the appropriate level of identifiability revealed. And we coordinate this through what we call the context engine, which is the ecosystem that supports it. Now, why am I harping on this metadata? I'm going to give you a couple examples of why this is important and why context is important. So here's a study back from COVID when all the chest images were being uploaded into the cloud. The world was collaborating around this data, and the world's brightest of minds in data science were coming towards this imaging saying, we're going to build AI tools to help diagnose COVID because this is a necessity. And what ended up happening is a lot of these models just started to fail. So MIT went back and started reviewing why did these models fail, and they realized that the data scientists had gone straight to the data, the images, and started building out models. They had looked past the metadata. A really important component was the age of the patient. And what had happened was when you just feed the images in without considering that metadata, they were training COVID negative versus COVID positive, but in fact, the majority of the chest images that were COVID negative in this big data set very early in the pandemic were pediatric. And so the models were learning the difference between pediatric and adult lungs instead of COVID versus no COVID. If they had paused and looked at the metadata and looked at the age of the patient, this would not have happened. So it was just a nice, sobering, well, maybe not nice, but it was a sobering reminder for us to actually pay attention to that contextual metadata. And there's many examples you can probably start to imagine where this can happen in the cancer space. So if you're focusing in on the genomics, or you're focusing in on the images as your primary data that you want to look at, if you're ignoring everything else and just going straight to the data, you may miss the forest from the trees. And so pay attention to what your cohort looks like. And that's the reason why we use metadata as the findability tool, so that you can actually start to pay attention to the differences and characterize your data before you dive into actually building a model. Another example in terms of context of how you're going to use this model is, if you have, we had various different EPIC models that we've actually evaluated in our hospital. And one of the models that we had evaluated was around falls and as well as sepsis. And the thing is that in a cancer hospital, you need to think about where are you actually going to use these models. And so if you take an inpatient model, inpatient ward at MD Anderson who are doing CAR T-cell therapy, and you're trying to detect sepsis using a generic EPIC sepsis tool, not going to work because these patients are their immune state is very different. They've been through multiple potentially through multiple lines of systemic therapy. And so their signals are going to be very different from the generic healthy population. Similarly, if you take those same patients and try to run a falls algorithm, you'll have everyone with red bracelets, and that's not going to help us address any sort of operational problem at all. And so really thinking through the context, again, of where you're going to use these models will help you address whether it's an appropriate model to be even considering, will save you a lot of time. And so we've started to take that approach in terms of prioritizing what models are we even going to do pilots on and evaluate moving forward. Now, as we think about all the different models that are being developed out of the EHR, I like to remind everyone of this paper in JAMA that came out that showed the prevalence and sources of duplicate information in the EHR, some of those duplicates being errors. And so even if you were to go back directly to the EHR and run an LLM, you may get the wrong laterality. You may get a wrong diagnosis, depending on at what point in the course of time you're looking at the chart for this patient. Because the thing is that it may be that the incorrect diagnosis was the presumed diagnosis for a long period of time until someone did an additional test to clarify what happened and there was an aha moment. Well, if you run through the entire chart, it's going to come up with the most likely probability, and the most likely probability based on the frequency of that diagnosis appearing may be the wrong diagnosis. So just be mindful as you're thinking about using this technology and understand what those pitfalls are. Many groups have also looked at using EHR data to start to say, I can predict what the treatment decision is going to be. And the one caution that I put there, not to say that you can't do this in all circumstances, but a cautionary note here as a physician, I would say, is that there may be relevant critical information that just doesn't make it into the EHR. A conversation on the phone or in the hallway with a colleague that you're trying to tease out any discrepancies, complications or coordination decisions that may have led to a critical treatment decision. A conversation with a family member around different principles or priorities for that patient. And that may have driven the treatment decision, but now you're training a model looking at patterns of whatever is available in the EHR and the treatment decision. And that pattern may exist. It may not actually explain the clinical decision-making process. So it's just again, a cautionary note, and we'll have to figure out how to address this gap, but it's a gap that does actually exist. Here's an example of context of the clinical training and validation versus the context of clinical implementation. So there's lots of tools out there in radiology now that will say it can help you detect a lung nodule. In many circumstances, the training data looks like the training data that I show you on the left. Nice, clean lungs with little round balls as nodules. If you run this model in the patient on the right, if it was the room, I would ask you to put your hand up if you think this would fail, that this model would not work. And the likelihood of this model being successful is very, very low, because you can see all of the lung disease in the diseased lung on the right. It's not the same kind of data. You're actually using the model in a context that it has not actually been trained, will likely not work. And so just being able to pay attention to where you're actually going to deploy this model. I've had conversations even with regulatory groups around the fact that perhaps we should be treating the AI models more closer to a drug versus a device, because the models will perform better if it's actually seen that kind of data before, and we've seen this time and time again. And so trying to make sure that we're actually paying attention to what circumstance you're actually going to use the models is probably important.
So,
here's
Dr.
just an example in terms, yes.
There is a question about portability of context. Jeremy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? So
sure.
question,
Yes.
I
was just wondering if there are any standards bodies or anything that is gaining any traction around defining shared, semantic layer definitions or data quality initiatives or, anything like that that would allow the data to be portable with its context and with its metadata, and the second half of that would be, in the context of publish or perish, right? I could see everybody wanting to be very protective of their data in institutions, not allowing people access. And I know there's the Cancer AI Alliance, that's out there now. And I'm just wondering what sort of progress is there, or is there progress?
So there are growing initiatives to make, so there's a couple different directions that this is actually going. So one around, in terms of at least clinical care and making sure that the context is available. Let's put the academic research side topic aside. Oh. Sorry about that. So are you there?
Yes, we are here and we can hear you.
Okay, so putting the academic research topic aside, I'll address that in a moment. In terms of the clinical space, there are growing efforts in terms of data interoperability, and there is a growing awareness around the fact that the metadata needs to come along, including some of the technology vendors and requirements of how much needs to be ported from one area to another to allow that data usability to be increased. So there are multiple RFIs that are out from the HHS, from the NIH, et cetera, looking at the academic space as well as the clinical care space in this area. And so it's a rapidly evolving field, and the direction has been more and more around how do we make the data interoperable and accessible, both for clinical care, but for instance, there's a data management and sharing policy from the NIH around all NIH-funded research, making sure that the data becomes available for everyone to collectively do research. Obviously, this is in balance with the sensitivities of privacy for extra sensitive data, but I think the general direction has been going in the direction to make data appropriately accessible rather than creating more data silos. Hopefully that answers your question, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. This is just a final example of the fact that, this part, I couldn't believe how pixelated. This is real world data in the upper left-hand corner. This is not synthetic. This is literally reconstructions of CTs, and you can see that the highest quality is in the right lower corner and the poorest quality is in the upper left-hand corner. And there's a pretty stark difference that you can actually notice. And the fact that no matter how good these AI models are, you can see that the AUROC curves are really stunning once the image resolution gets to a certain point of 0.9. I would say that's reasonably good for clinical use, but below a certain quality, they'll all drop off. And so this is the other piece that we have been talking about in terms of image quality, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the subsequent slide. But here is an example where this image quality does vary a lot. And I give you this example in the upper right around small brain metastases. These are secondary tumors that get developed in the brain from primary cancers, such as lung cancer, breast cancer, GI cancers, all these solid malignancies that can actually go up through the blood system and actually create these tiny little secondary brain tumors called brain metastases. And they can be detected as small as 1 or 2 millimeters on a standard of care MRI, and I would say most standard of care MRIs, only because the variability can be quite large. So you can see that we reconstructed these images at 1 millimeter, which is the resolution that we had acquired it at, 2 millimeters and 3 millimeters, and you can see even if you squint with the eye of faith, knowing that the tumor that is at the end of the red arrow is there, it's invisible on the 3mm scan. I give the analogy that if you're trying to slice raisin bread so you can count every single raisin and measure it, you would slice that bread pretty thin. It's the same concept with the MRI. And so if you slice it thicker, you will likely not be able to see the tumor. And it doesn't matter if you have an AI model or you're looking as a human, if it's not in the image, it's just not there. And so I actually had the privilege of writing this article with the Federation of American Scientists that actually allude to the need for quantitative imaging approaches to revolutionize AI and precision medicine moving forward. And so if we were to all get more consistent imaging and have the metadata around how that imaging was acquired, we'd be able to, A, improve clinical care because you'd need reduced number of repeat scans and we would be less likely to miss tumors, which we currently potentially are with the variability of the imaging. We could actually get more accurate quantitative imaging biomarkers to be used in clinical care. We could reduce the healthcare costs by reducing the number of repeated scans or potentially misdiagnoses that cause more symptoms downstream. And we may actually improve the accessibility of medical imaging with newer market technologies if everyone was able to adopt these sorts of technologies more efficiently. From an AI perspective, this would actually allow for faster AI training as well as improved AI deployment, because remember I said that if the image quality drops, doesn't matter how good the model is, it won't work. But if we actually maintained a certain minimum standard, most of these models would probably work more consistently. And we do call out that we probably need to create these centers of excellence for quantitative imaging moving forward, educate all the stakeholders, get buy-in from the vendors, just as you were alluding to, Jeremy, around participation across academic centers, clinics, as well as vendors across the board to make this work as a system. And I'm coming almost to the end. In terms of the different kinds of training, validation, and test sets, again, context does matter. And many people pay attention to context and bias. And when you say bias, you immediately go to the age, race, ethnicity, and those are all true, but also pay attention to the availability of data. How frequently is this person coming in? And especially if you're doing a predictive model, if for distance purposes, financial purposes, social purposes, someone is coming in for tests less frequently than someone else, they're likely to get diagnosed with a recurrence of tumor later just because they did not come in. And so pay attention to that frequency of your data availability because it may actually influence the performance of your model. The other piece is pay attention to the measurement error bias. So if it's imaging, what scanner did you use? If it was an assay, what assays were used? How heterogeneous were those assays? I was just looking with one of our clinicians who's also very interested in data science, looking at the different genomics panels that are run. And if someone was only run on a very shallow panel with limited number of genes tested, they may not have mutations detected. Does not necessarily mean the mutations aren't there. It just means that you did not test for them. So pay attention to all of that context as you're considering the data sets that you're working with. Now, as I said, AI models that work on day one may not work through its life cycle, and it's because the data can change, your clinical workflow may change, the treatments may change, and your patient biology may change. So all of these contextual pieces can actually affect the performance of your model. So if you're going to turn a model on, the responsible thing to do would be to continue to monitor model performance throughout its life cycle, and even consider proactively when and how often you should reevaluate to sunset models, because there's always new technology coming on board. And this is just a philosophy that we've taken at the organization. Sean Stapleton, who created this slide, is my director for model implementation and lifecycle management. So thinking through that entire partnership with the operational teams or the clinical teams and thinking through the entire life cycle. Now, AI, I would say, is different from other technology because it really is all three of these cogs working together for AI to really work seamlessly. That you need the people you need the data, and it's not just people within one area. For instance, if you're thinking about scanning technology or a genomic technology, it may be that core team that's working on it. But in many circumstances for AI, if you're looking at various different clinical parameters or clinical plus genomic parameters, you're looking at teams across the organization that all need to be working in sync. And all these cogs need to run together to flow the appropriate data. And the operational implementation is not just plunk a device into the workflow. You'll have to think about how do you actually integrate this into the workflow without causing additional slowdowns or work, and et cetera. And so how do you really drive an effective operational workflow with this new technology? And it may mean talking through and redesigning your operational workflow now that this technology is available. And it's interesting because the human AI interactions is something that we're still continuing to learn about. The training pieces are really important. I will make a call out here that we do have an ASCO for those of you, given that a lot of you are from Fred Hutch in terms of the cancer world. We do have an ASCO AI community of practice. You don't have to be an ASCO member to be part of that community of practice. There's usually an ongoing stream of questions and topics that get covered. So I welcome you to join. So if you just look up at ASCO communities of practice, you should be able to sign up and join that. And often we put lots of good resources, et cetera, for you to learn. In terms of trust, I would say that there's two camps at this point. There's people who believe that humans are better than the machines and will continue to trust themselves and undervalue AI. And then there's those who start to become the AI zealots who just start to rely on AI. And I think that ultimately where we probably want to land is somewhere where you have a balance between those two, that you're critically thinking about the outputs without letting it be all consuming of your time, and being willing to learn while still knowing that there are going to be limitations and guardrails and risks of using the AI, that it's not perfect, just like you would trust or not trust a new person that you've just met. And so thinking through all of those aspects is something that we're also trying to think about in terms of how do we actually make that interaction useful so that we increase the thinking and the critical thinking. If we've saved a lot of time through other aspects leveraging technology, how do we create that pause so someone will actually think? And so this is something that we're really thinking through. And there's an emerging philosophy around this concept of cyborg psychology, is that as you continue to interact with this, we are learning that the human brain is processing information differently. And so there's a whole field of research that's growing in terms of how do we actually work with this and work with this to our advantage moving forward. For example, there is de-skilling with AI as you become reliant on the technology. And so, for instance, I've started to read about how pilots are trained to know when to overcome and when do you take away the autopilot so that you make sure that they keep their skills up so that they know what to do if autopilot stops working. And I'm sure all of you who fly would be grateful for the pilot to know what to do. So these are the kinds of things that we have to start thinking through as we continue to integrate AI into practice. So I'll end with these thoughts that AI has great promise, and the best way for us to really leverage this in the cancer world is to embrace the complexity of data and tackle medicine as that science of uncertainty with the art of probability. And we can center that on the person who has the illness. And so by first investing in the defined purpose or the problem you're trying to solve, you can better consider the full context, the people, the data, the operational processes, the digital environment, and the regulations that will inform that fit for purpose solution. And obviously with patient care, quality and safety will definitely apply, as well as for all technologies across the healthcare space. And this will require that collective effort from across the system of systems. So I'm there and open up for questions. If you want to follow me, this is my LinkedIn, and I've written some interesting articles in Financial Times as well as Forbes. So happy to answer questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung. This was really amazing, and a lot of what you said really resonated. Like what you said about the COVID classifier, right? Like it's not really a COVID versus not COVID classifier. It is a young versus old lung classifier, right? So it's like we were talking about these features, like the snow in the background in the Huskies versus Wolves classifier, like the classic example. So this was amazing. I have an opening question while others are thinking of their questions, and that is like how many functional AI models do you actually have at MD Anderson in application, and do some of them are some of them also the broad AI versus the narrow AI, as in the newer LLM kind of models, or a lot more of them are specific narrow AI kind of models?
Sure. I mean, we have a lot of embedded AI in radiology, obviously, and we do have those narrower models in the AI and pathology space. And in terms of the broader, I would say that, like most hospitals, we're starting to roll out ambient technology and Copilot and those sorts of technologies as broader AI. We are actually working on a project collectively with various clinicians from across the institution to build out a foundation model. So that's sort of, I would call it still a small language model in the grand scheme of things, but we are working on more of a refined cancer-focused small language model. So we've got various different multimodal models that are being developed in various labs across the Institute for Data Science. So it's a heterogeneous collection.
Thank you. Do people have questions?
Hi, I'm curious about if you can comment on building AI models regarding rare type of diseases where the data set would be much, much smaller, if there is any initiatives being taken for considering building this kind of AI model for rare type of diseases.
Yeah, so for the rare type of diseases, we've actually taken two approaches. One is that the rare tumors are not as rare at MD Anderson. We actually see large volumes of rare tumors. And so we have taken that privilege to have that many rare tumors come to actually build out some build out AI models. But we've also taken when you actually start breaking down even the common tumors down to the subtypes based on molecular genomic profiling, they do start to become unique in themselves. And whether it be the rare tumors or subtypes, we've also started to explore hybrid mechanistic with AI models. So we've looked at sort of these hybrid models that with the mechanistic models, you can actually use much smaller numbers of patients. And so that's one way you could actually tackle that. The other thing this is pure exploration, but leveraging a foundation model and fine-tuning it or leveraging that foundation model to build onto a rare tumor is something else that you could actually definitely explore. So those are three different approaches that we're exploring.
Thank you.
Any other questions? This is perfect. We're 1 minute from the end of the time. Thank you very much, Dr. Chung. This was just amazing. This was a lot of information, and I definitely learned a lot of new things. I have one stupid question. So let's officially end here, so that if people want to leave, please feel free to. But if you have a couple more minutes, Dr. Chung, I had a couple more questions, and please feel free to stick around if you can. So I have a stupid question. What is quantitative imaging?
So quantitative imaging is the metrology to make sure that you're actually measuring the same thing each time you actually approach it. So I think that a lot of people don't realize just how different all the imaging is. So if you went to a CT scanner or an MRI scanner and you said you were going to get, let's say you needed to get an MRI of your knee, I'm just making this up, right? So you went to get an MRI of your knee. If you went to 10 different MRI scanners, or you went to the same MRI scanner and used a different protocol, and you said, can you read certain numbers out of that MRI scan? You're going to get different measurements. And so that's not quantitative imaging. Just because you get numbers don't mean that it's quantitative. What we mean about quantitative imaging is just like with labs, when you go and get your red blood cell count or you get your sodium, you can go back to that same lab. And the reason why it's CLIA certified is because you should be getting the same number plus or minus some percent error that's accepted. And that is that quantitative imaging. But we don't currently treat imaging data in the same way. And so what we're saying is we have to elevate imaging to the same level as a lab assay, because if we're going to feed it into algorithms like AI, and you're taking imaging measurements and you're saying, I'm going to predict something. Well, now if you have these error bars that are uncertain, and you're not confident that your measurement of, let's say, a tumor is actually 3 centimeters and another tumor, and you measure that same tumor on another scanner and it's 2 centimeters, well, the tumor shrank, and it's not that the tumor actually shrank, your measurement is that far off. And this is going to be a big problem for us to really reliably use these sorts of data sets to, predict anything with our models.
That is very helpful. Thank you very much. So, I'm kind of thinking of it as, instead of submitting an image of an iris, you submit like the sepal length and the sepal width. Like you extract out some numbers, and in the imaging, it's clinically meaningful numbers.
It is pulling out those numbers, but it's also making sure that those numbers are consistent across different people measuring, and you knowing how much of an error there is in that measurement. That's what makes it quantitative.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, this is cool. And I'm impressed that you have all these different pieces in your program, the literacy program and the life cycle piece of it and the implementation piece of it, which is because the chasm that you talked about, right? Like the research and the implementation. So what works the best in this transfer? Like, how do you go from the research to the implementation, or do you start in both ends and then meet in the middle? How are you able to successfully cross that?
So one of the best examples of doing that well is actually when the person who's trying to develop the AI algorithm and doing the research goes out and meets with the clinicians or whoever is going to use the tool and really understand what is the workflow that they're doing and what is the problem they're trying to solve. So an example that we have is one of our leads within the Institute for Data Science and Oncology. He's an engineer in training by training, but he started to work with the anesthesiologist to look at all of the vitals data on their anesthesiology machines during the OR. And because there was such rich data there that was being collected consistently, thinking through, yes, that's available. And the anesthesiologists were saying, if I knew I needed to intervene when some of these numbers changed a certain amount to prevent a bad thing happening around the surgery or shortly after surgery, I would want to know that. And so they started looking and they realized that when people suddenly had a blood pressure drop of more than a certain amount, and you could track this, the data is always there, they actually had a much worse outcome. And so all of a sudden, the anesthesiologists were getting this notification to intervene because they have controls and they have drugs that they can use to actually address that and intervene early. So that would actually improve the outcomes of patients' surgeries, for example. So that's a real partnership between the person who's developing the algorithms and the actual clinical teams that are going to be using the algorithm.
Yeah, that's perfect. That matches exactly with something a Penn State data scientist told me about. So they have this way of filling out a Mad Lib. Like if as somebody, if at this time while I was doing this, if I knew this is what I would do, right? Like so
yes.
exactly. Yeah. think about how it will fit in the workflow. Yes, thank you very
That's
much.
right.
We are 5 minutes over, so I want to really thank you for your time today. Very grateful that you could join us and share your expertise with us. Thank you.
Sure. Happy to. Great seeing you all. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Bye.